and Justin have been to like our porch speakeasy a lot, which is so nice.
I see Miss Bullock in the crowd right now.
Devil. That's so nice.
Okay. I'm gonna start my introductions. If you are all set.
All right.
Yeah, good. Welcome everyone. My name is Maris Kreisman and I run events and marketing at McNally Jackson, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you tonight to another excellent virtual event for the store. If you go to McNallyJackson.com and look at our events calendar, you'll see all the amazing writers and programs we're hosting in the coming days and weeks. I'm adding more every day, so please keep an eye on the site or subscribe to our newsletter to hear more about what's coming soon. There will be time at the end of tonight's conversation for your questions. You can use the Zoom chat function to submit any question you have, and we'll get to them towards the end of the evening. We're glad that even though we can't be all in the same room, we're still able to host events this way during this difficult time. As we've changed phases from staying at home to opening for curbside pickup to again admitting customers into our 4 locations, indie bookstores like ours still need more support. And so if you enjoy free events like this and want us to keep hosting more of them, please buy books from us. I'll post a link to buy Vanessa and Karen's books from our website into the chat. And I will also post a link to our events fund because we would really appreciate any donations you can spare. And now I will stop begging. I'm so happy to see Karen Russell, whose sleep donation is available for the first time in paperback now. In the New York Times Book Review, when it was originally published in 2014, Michiko Kakutani wrote, "Written with Twilight Zone-like inventiveness and the energy and brio of a natural fantasist with a proclivity for blending the real and surreal, the psychological and the sci-fi, Russell creates a fully imagined world with its own rituals and rules and deftly satirizes the media and governmental responses to the plague of sleeplessness." Yeah. I'm so delighted to have her in conversation with Vanessa Veselka, whose The Great Offshore Grounds was longlisted this year for a National Book Award in fiction. And on Goodreads, Roxane Gay said, "A magnificent beast of a novel, utterly original, one of the rare novels that understands the realities of American poverty. Epic." I am so delighted to have both of these women in this Zoom, and take it away. Thanks so much.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for having us. Karen and I are buddies, and she is going to read first, and then I'm going to torture her with some questions, and then we'll reverse it a little bit. But I'm a huge fan, Karen. Why don't you go read?
Thanks, Vanessa. Likewise. Thank you, Maris, for hosting us. This is like a dream pairing for me. And also I have the great luxury of getting to walk in dimensions with Vanessa. So it's fun to get to mix up the mediums. And just also know that, maybe next week we'll get to see each other in shadow casting reality. But this is amazing because there are a lot of people who I'm seeing here who we wouldn't get to be in a room with them. And it's nice. It's so nice of you guys to come. There's a lot competing for your attention right now. So I know we especially appreciate it. And I have to heartily second Roxane Gay, but I'll save that for when we do our switcheroo. Yeah, I'm just going to read a little bit. This is Sleep Donation came out in 2014, and long before coronavirus existed, this was sort of slated for a print edition. So I have the especially uncanny position of putting out a book about a nightmare epidemic into the one we're currently living in. So I thought I'd read just a little bit about that. And I think, it's a book now, and it has these beautiful illustrations that I kind of think are the best part of it. But I'm trying to think if there's any context you guys need. It's about an insomnia in America, and there's this new technology that lets healthy sleepers donate to insomniacs. And then there's sort of a twist where the nation's sleep supply becomes corrupted by a nightmare. So, and its protagonist is a recruiter for this organization, the Slumber Corps. So let's see. The Slumber Corps' life-saving operations run on the public's trust and goodwill. Where money is concerned, we have to be careful. According to my bosses, we're working on establishing a scholarship fund for Baby A, our universal donor, some kind of trust in her name. Legally, we are desperate, says my boss, to find a way to express our organization's gratitude to the family for the gift of their baby's sleep. But this expression of gratitude must be made with diplomacy, sensitivity. It's delicate, Rudy tells me. It's very illegal, echoes Jim. Nobody in our MOBA band would suggest that the raw market would do a better or a fairer job of matching insomniacs and donors than the slumber core. None of us can imagine the solution proposed by many factions, the sale of sleep, leading to an equitable system. Not that the slumber core is a perfect matchmaker. Our cold calling can feel scattershot. Our dependence on strangers to refill the dream wells is total. The sleep banks are routinely on appeal for more units. You cannot program omniscience into our hospital computers, and people die on our waiting lists every night. But our goal at least is articulable, stable, and very clear to get clean, deep sleep to the insomniacs. And I'm proud to say that in its history, the slumber core has never rejected an insomniac for financial reasons or requested any kind of payment. When I registered the Harkonnens as donors, I had no idea that their daughter's sleep was a miracle in progress. I wrote this before I had kids of my own when I still thought that baby sleep was like, as advertised by that cliche, sleep like a baby. Now I know better, but anyway, this is a unicorn baby. Baby A is still the world's only known universal donor, but there have been several cases of sleep donations that can be accepted by a remarkable percentage of insomniacs. 3 years ago, we found highly transfusible sleep inside a 92-year-old Swedish man in Laramie. Immediately after his donation, he slipped into a coma, and ever since, against the wishes of some family members, the Wyoming Slumber Corps has been mining him for sleep, a phrase favored by the media. Which is funny, my boss snarls, when you consider all the mining, drilling, and earth rape they are actually doing in Wyoming. And here we have this living saint sustaining hundreds with his sleep. The old man signed a contract before losing consciousness, stipulating that he wanted his body to be farmed for sleep until his death, his last bequest. I admire the generosity of our Wyoming donor, and I invoke him at drives. But I've also had such vibrant nightmares where I see the orphaned animal of his body tethered to Gould's machinery by the blue wires, strapped onto the cot, strapped into the helmet, his feet curling in socks. Baby A's life would have been far better off, I'm certain, if I'd never found her. The Harkonnens live in a transitional neighborhood, houses that you might call fixer-uppers or historic or derelict, depending on how cheerful you are feeling. Even light seems hesitant to enter them. Last year, many of the rotting facades got repainted in gumball shades of pink and lime, some misguided civic project to brighten this part of the city. It's a very superficial shellacking. The cars and motorcycles outside are still junkers, and lawns are covered with many octaves of weed shading from crud brown to yellowy beige. And even the leafy trees seem to me to have too many limbs, mutating away from the rooftops in a silent, wild freedom. Several bikes knock around on their chains an eerily genial sound, as if the machines are gossiping. Early spring and the whole block smells like flowers. The heaving blossoms turn out to be everywhere once you notice them, overflowing the rain gutters and the sills of second-story windows, unencouraged, unsupported, nevertheless here once more, vivid white in the night air. Beauty staging its coup in every suburb and slum in the galaxy. You are lucky to be alive to see it, aren't you? I tell myself. I have several canned lectures designed to reduce my nausea after talking about my sister, which I mentally self-administer in my boss's stern voice. Here they come again, the white flowers, bystanders rooted in the bright light flowing from our sleep van. Bodies move with their own sly life behind the windows, bending and straightening, and for no easily discernible reason, I am terrified to re-enter it. At some sore point on my revolution around the Harkonnens block, I seem to have removed my name badge, my core recruiter jacket. I'd much prefer to remain a stranger out here underneath these fragrant narcotics, the ruffling white blossoms. Now I hear the baby crying. Up ahead, I see the Harkonnens two-tone Chevy, brown and turquoise, the basketball hoop with its frayed net. Underneath it, the sleep van is parked with its rear doors wide open, spilling light across the lawn. Framed in the window, I see baby A strapped to the catch crib, her tiny feet tensing and relaxing. No, no, I hear the nurses say. See the bag inflating? She's still breathing on her own. Get a seal on that, Carmen. Get a tighter seal on that. I'll stop there, but this is the picture. I don't know if anyone can see it. That's what these artists imagined was happening. And that it had, thanks. I feel like I just read right to Vanessa. It's like our weird.
No, and I love it that you did. I know there are other people out there, but I'm just looking at you, Karen. That was great. And I love this novella. And I think that you and I talked a little bit over the weekend about different areas that we were going to touch on. But one of the ones I'm going to dive right into is this question of insight. Because in sleep donation, right, there's this, the obvious elements of pulling healthy sleep from the future, right? Like from future life, you're borrowing from the future life to sort of, soothe into unconsciousness the living adults of the day, right? Like there's this kind of very clear statement, right? But what makes it, there's a bunch of things that make it really unusual and unique, is also the sort of incredible discipline and rigor of imagination, where you instead of just painting enough of that picture to sort of make your point, I never felt the sense that you were trying to make a point. I feel like the characters that inhabits this world and all of the ways in which every idea is played out to its fullest extent, right? Like every possible thing, from the physical of like, how would you plug something in? What would be the reaction, to the sort of bureaucratic, goes to this point of normalizing the abnormal, but also creating a kind of a sense of endless reality. When you look at video games now, right? And there's that, I remember when you couldn't go in all directions and find stuff, right? Like, it's like, don't look in that part, there's only something ahead,
Yeah.
and yet there's this sense that like you could go as far as you wanted in this world, and it is fully complete. And that is what I mean by rigor. And in that sense, and I want to come back to that a little bit, but I want to talk about insight with regards to that. So you and I think one of the things I love about your work completely is that on every page, there's an insight. There is an insight into a human experience, in a way to look at the world, in a way to re-see things. I feel like you just re-see and re-see and re-see. And it's like every page, multiple times a page. And I think a lot of times writers, in the way we talk about writing, we don't talk about insight enough. It's so important to have something to say and not just the way to say it. I feel like there's a sort of, we can get super polished, and we can get, the delivery device can be very, very effective, but what's inside of it actually matters. And that's one of the things I love about your writing. So I don't know if you want to jump in and talk about.
This means so much to me, coming from you, Vanessa, and to the leader. It really does, because I think, well, my experience has sometimes been with the editing process, right? And it makes sense, right? It's like an expedient way to approach editing is to make something resemble stories that already exist, or make something resemble storylines that one is familiar with. So to sort of like lop off, when I was talking about that tree with like these mutating branches, sometimes I do feel like it can be an issue for me drafting. I really enjoy following all of these, and there's a sort of like voluptuousness, or there's like, and it can feel like Florida kudzu sprawl, and so I thank God for editors, because
yes,
sometimes you need a brave soul to come in there with their machete and like help you to see. I mean, there's sometimes I think it's I love metaphor, for example, and sometimes I'll even say, well, there's this sort of proliferation of metaphor here, and it's obfuscating things. It's not making something
clearer, right?
More visible. So that's, that balance I think can be tricky. But I definitely have fought in my life as a writer for unusual story shapes, or a narrative, or, things that don't arc the way people are expecting them to, or things that can feel maybe like digressive in a way that,
right.
Is surprising to me, or feel, these aren't like sort of random, like some of these questions or juxtapositions. And I thank you for that reading, because I also think it can be like, it's more demanding maybe on a reader. I think about this sometimes. I love Alexander Heyman, who's a writer who, English is not his first language. And one of the things I love about him is that reseeing. So he'll have like, an elderly couple. So he's an immigrant to this country. So he sees our country with these fresh eyes, first of all, but it will also be these subtle, things that you would miss in your daily life and you have permission to linger on in a story or a novel. So he's like, look at these elderly, he's like giving people salad and somebody is complaining that it's like, iceberg instead of romaine and they're sending it back and he's about to be fired from a job that he hates, which I think is something your characters, it's like, I'm sure there's a German word for that specific anxiety of being fired from a job you despise and feel condescended, but it's like this elderly couple, their hands are locked like this. And he says, it looks like white frogs humping. And I was like, well, it's just a different optic. And suddenly you really can see again. It's fun to have these little kids because I feel like they don't have the same kind of categories and hierarchies and they're not indoctrinated into the kind of language that we are. They're not inured to sort of the wonder and perversity of things. So that is, and I think with insight, I love, there's a lot of navigation in your book. And I think that is sort of, I wrote that story about the echolocating gondolas. I think it's a natural match for just the drafting process also, because when you sit down to write, you don't necessarily, that's part of like the joy and the terror of it, right? You're not even sure quite what you are arrowing for. And the story is going to be a vehicle to take you deeper into some question or preoccupation. And I feel like readers sense that. I feel like I can always sense that if the energy is one of a quest, a genuine quest versus an op-ed that you're trying to package into a story, or something that feels like a little more like paint by numbers, or you're arrowing towards a conclusion that in advance, and it's a different energy maybe behind that.
It is, and I mean, not that there isn't a purpose for that kind of opinion or that kind of laying out. Right. But I think that there's also, I worry sometimes that we're, as a culture, that we're sometimes afraid to tell big stories, that we're afraid of scope as an act of being like out of control. You know what I mean? Like there's this anxiety that around that. And I think there's sometimes a lot of sort of side-eyeing anxiety around it between people, like, did you think that was good or did not think it was good? You know what I mean? Like and so I think that I like the fact that I always believe in your work that you are investigating something and the characters are investigating something, and it is that there is a point of view. There is something that is being said, learned, or attempted. Now I don't know if I'm embarrassing you. I'm going to read 2 more paragraphs of your stuff. So this is a beautiful short thing. It says, there are natural laws that govern the flow of a dream and the substance from body to body, laws that detect passage of electricity through tissue, the routes taken by ruby marrow and iodine crystals and colorless vibrations, laws to order every visible and invisible migration. And I feel certain that there must be a second set of laws, inscrutable but real, that govern exactly how much an individual can give to and receive from another, some hydrology of human generosity. Because there are these gifts we can make to one another reflexively, with no sting of loss. And there are these gifts that we fight to relinquish or beg to get. Like there's in that, it's beautiful writing, because it's yours, it's beautiful writing. But there's a real attempt to describe something that's ineffable. There's an attempt to be able to lock down something that you can't quite touch. And that to me is something I respect so much in writing, that earnest reaching, more than necessarily, I captured it under a cup, like so it may fly away, but
totally. I thank you so much. I love that. I'm sorry people watching have to watch me like turn red like the Kool-Aid man with like pleasure, but it's a, I absolutely agree. And there is a way where like, you don't want to feel like a lepidopterist necessarily, right? Like, I mean,
right, exactly.
And I think when I know I'm in a bad place with writing if I find myself like just chloroforming and like painting the dead wings of something. Like that is a really,
I know that feeling.
I know it very well. I'm like, here's my paragraph I made in 2016. Let me just like, which is like, yeah, it's different than sort of trying to lasso something in language that is actually going to overspill whatever borders you set up.
Right.
And it's, I mean, in a very, I mean, these are two very, very different books, but I do think that they're both very ambitious in what they're trying to talk about, which is having to invent a new language,
Yeah.
in a way, because the one that we've inherited is so
Can't
stained
describe the
through with
world
all
we're in.
kinds of, you know. We were laughing right before this call, but there's a line in Vanessa's book. I know how to echolocate patriarchy. I was just thinking about, I mean, how like even just everywhere, like on the airwaves, on the radio waves. I remember hearing Mary Gateskill, you know, somebody was complimenting her for writing about violence. And she was like, it's everywhere. This isn't, you know, what else would you write about if you were going to try to say anything about the reality we live in, you know?
Right.
Like our base, I mean, in her wonderful way, in her kind of shorn way, was like, this isn't something to applaud me for. You know? I mean, I don't,
yeah. I think,
but I do think I do sort of, and yeah, beyond just sort of representing I think there's this way too, where I read a lot of writing is described as prescient. And there is sort of like a reaching for the future, but I don't know that you can do that without seeing very deeply into this reality that, I mean, that is sufficiently mysterious, right? Like the present is very mysterious to me, and the way it cohabits with the past.
yes.
And that, I mean, I think, you know, we were talking about their kind of ghosts flitting, you know, flying through both of our work. I mean, like real ghosts that have voices and and manifest in the present. And it's like, of course, you know, because
Yeah.
how else would you really represent the temporal complexity of every day?
Well, right. And I think also to think of them past the voice, right? Like, because it's not like, we were talking about this before, but this idea that, you know, when something that seems speculative or otherwise comes up in my work, or often in yours, you know, it's more of a it is more of that spillover. It's more of a trying to say something and not finding the language for it. It's not that that character necessarily then provides the language for it. It's more like the entire sensual being is kind of like, I don't know, I tried to do this and it came out rat queen, I can't answer it, you know. And so yeah, I was also thinking, you know, the other danger though, when you think about like things of scope and things of this, I always think of like the biggest shade that ever got, Victorian shade that ever got, you know, said was definitely E.M. Forster attacking Conrad, saying the casket of his genius that the casket of his genius contains a vapor rather than a jewel. I was like, oh, you know, I was like, that's like, and so, you know, I think there's that sense, you know, insight that like a lot of times I do feel like it's not that a writer can't or doesn't even want to put something in it. It's, I don't know if it's anxiety. I don't know if it's fear of how we are afraid to just you know, bring our own voices, you know, but like this moment in time, politically, culturally, artistic, in all ways, like if we're not bringing who we really are, we're doomed.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, like this can't be just iteration.
Yeah, it can't be just iteration. I think I have a really hard time finding the right language for this, but I do feel like sometimes like there's a lot of power and radical freedom in the imagination and in the unthought possible. And sometimes I think the danger of a moment like this one, where you feel like you should be responding specifically. I mean, we need to be doing this too, you know, but I don't know. I was just having this discussion with a friend where she's like, well, you must feel like everything you write has to be political. And I'm like, well, I think it is I think it has been, you know, and we were just trying to sort this out. I was like, I'm not sure that everything has to be like a direct response to Donald J. Trump's latest, like the news of the day in that sort of narrow sense. Like, and that there is a place for that too, I'm sure. But I just sort of, I get nervous when it starts to feel like people are dictating to anybody else, you know, what their artistic project has to be or should be.
Absolutely.
And there's a real recombinatory power to the imagination that's like inexhaustible and limitless. And I mean, really, I think like, you know, that's what is so thrilling to me about this the synthesis that you achieve in this book. And I think you should read to us maybe in a couple minutes, but yeah, I chose that passage, Vanessa. I was just thinking about, there's a section in your book where, you know, I bet you'll frame it better than I can, but just the book kicks off with these two sisters, sort of their understanding of their own past is upended in this way, and they're given sort of a map to find their biological mother, one of these sisters' biological mother. But there's a section where we get to see their mother. You're sort of wondering, like, who set up this like cruel, like who thought this was a great idea? And then I really love, like, there's so many characters in this book. You can identify this desire to be part of a larger story, and like maybe their material circumstances. These aren't, you know, people who want to give their life unreservedly to something. So you have Sarah, you have Essex, who joins the Marines, Sarah, who's this activist, Livy, who's this badass seafaring sister. But there's just this huge desire to be part of a larger story and to have something, having a fate that you can author. And I was just thinking about these people in this sort of, nobody in the book who donates sleep or dreams is a wealthy person. Like, obviously, if these people come down with this epidemic, they're just buying their sleep somewhere. You know, I'm sure that's how it would play out in any universe you can imagine.
Yeah, there's a lot of similar economics in both the books in some sense. And
then there's sort of that fear, like there's like a really beautiful desire that collides with a very predatory reality.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm trying to say, you know, something that is just gorgeous, you know, and probably close to universal. And then you see how in our reality, like even the distribution of horizon light is profoundly unequal, you know, and who gets to author their own story, who gets to live like a spacious hour. I was thinking about Essex, you know, who has a day of freedom, like if that, you know, and, you know, buying minutes for a phone, like purchasing time to talk, like connect with. And I think like it's just so finding a way to represent that, you know. I mean, it's kind of goofy to imagine, I guess, like a dream for sale, but I just think it's like a way of literalizing what's happening in this economy anyways.
Yeah, this question of like, you know, American economy and whose it is, and who, you know, who is the resource that is mined for it versus who, you know, and who are the miners in that resource, and who are, you know, who are the, all the stages of it. I think that's something that definitely we share. And I know that we talked about donation a little bit in the sense that, you know, in The Great Offshore Grounds, there's a character who's selling plasma. Well, you know, anybody who's sold plasma knows that's also a donation. Like, it's not a donation, right? Like it's $25 they give you for like a horrific whole day sitting in a place, you know, and then they take something from you that they sell for $2,500, and it's a donation. You know what I mean? Like it's absolutely insane all the ways we are expected to donate. And I work as a union organizer with nursing home workers and caregivers, and they're expected to donate their labor for the, you know, health of all of the people they care for all the time. So people get rich off them. You know what I mean? Like there's this constant question of donation. I think that in terms of talking about Offshore Grounds, the two characters in the family, what you raised about it is, you know, it's these two sisters. They're 33 when the novel starts. You know, they're poor, their whole family's poor, you know, and they're at a point in their lives where they're trying to sort of say, okay, how do I get here from there? And that has always been going on, the how do I get here from there?
Yeah.
But it doesn't, but I think what comes to them is, you know, that awareness that a lot of people in that age group have, you know, I love that time period between like 33 and 37 or something like that, because it's kind of like all the ideas you had about who you might have been, meant to be, wanted to be, your aesthetics, what constitutes a sellout, not a sellout, whatever your framework is, you've kind of had your chance to run its course. And I don't mean that in the sense of like somebody who has a lot of privilege being able to just sort of play for those years. I mean, like you're gaming out your ideas of how you talk about yourself, your life, your coming of age story, you're bringing it all together. And then like you hit that point where like unless you're like a complete alcoholic or a complete liar to yourself, you know that the coming of age story doesn't mean anything anymore because potentials doesn't matter. You've hit the point like potential doesn't matter. You know, it's all what you do. And so the characters are starting at that point where like, yeah, potential doesn't matter. And moving forward to try to figure out like, how do they have their game on the American night? You know, how do they, Americans are gambling, you know, there's cab drivers and sexual, I mean, there's a lot of thing, you know, it's, so yeah, I mean, I guess I'll read something. You wanted me to read the beginning. Do you want, maybe I'll read a little bit of the beginning and a little bit of something else.
Yeah,
But
whatever you want, whatever you, but this, I'd be happy to hear anything.
Okay, I'll read the beginning and then maybe one page of something else. 15 miles south of Seattle and halfway across Puget Sound to the west is Maury Island. Shaped like an arrowhead aimed at the mainland, green as the inner fold of a grass blade, it can be seen from the air, cradled in a crook of an elbow of water. Tourists ride over on ferries to watch for whales and UFOs. Jets turn around overhead on their final approach to the airport. Even on days when there is no rain, mist filters through the evergreens until it pulls apart like threadbare cloth and burns off. The wedding was to be held in the afternoon at Point Robinson, the site of an old fog signal station that once housed a steam whistle fed by coal fire and water to warn away ships. In 1897, at the dawn of massive capital expansion and speculation, the whistle sounded for 528 hours, nearly killing the man who had to shovel the 35 tons of coal. The cargo had to be kept from the rocks, and who can halt the lumbering desires of the world? In 1915, the lighthouse with its state-of-the-art fifth-order Fresnel lens was built. Powered initially by oil vapor lamps, its beacon could be seen for 12 miles. The lens was the perfect manifestation of Victorian technology, replacing simple flat lenses with faceted crystal domes, prisms cut into tiers that made it both astonishingly beautiful and a breakthrough in optics. The Fresnel lens had a theoretically infinite capacity to capture diffuse light, and by way of internal reflection, cast it like a spear through darkness. It lit stages in celluloid, Polaroid shots and retinas for ID scans. And on Point Robinson, it lit Puget Sound. These days, every modern ship has a GPS, and the little lighthouse is just a decoration on a brochure, a destination for a grade school field trip. The mechanisms that rotated the original lantern remain on the first floor, which is now a tiny museum of technology with gauges and wheels and iron bolted into the base, with lines that lead nowhere and do nothing. Back across the sound in Seattle, Livy looked out the window of her basement apartment. Her father was getting married that afternoon, and though it was already late April, a cold, wet breeze still whistled through the gaps in the caulking, turning her skin to goose flesh. A few feet away stood her sister Cheyenne, poorly slept and already dressed. "I'm freezing," said Cheyenne. "Turn on the space heater." "Turn on the oven, they charge us for electricity," said Livy. Cheyenne rolled her eyes, but went over to the little white gas stove. Cranking the temperature to broil, she leaned back against the oven so she could feel the heat on her hamstrings while it warmed. Yesterday, they'd spent the whole day picking rocks out of Livy's landlord's garden in trade for a patch of soil near the sunny side of the fence so that Livy could grow food. It wasn't political. Livy didn't care about pesticides or permaculture. She was just the cheapest person that Cheyenne had ever known. She lived off past date groceries. She washed her clothes once a month with a teaspoon of dish soap in a tub. She made her own bras. Cheyenne was pretty sure that if she could have rinsed and reused dental dams, she would have rinsed and reused dental dams if she thought it would work. Recently, Livy had become convinced that she could feed herself on 3 square yards of land. It was ridiculous, but since Cheyenne had appeared out of nowhere and moved in on her without warning or rent, she didn't have much of a say. Taller and unfreckled, Cheyenne had chosen a rose-colored cap sleeve shirt with eyelets and a pair of black pinstripe suit pants. She could pass in the crowd they'd be in today. Her secondhand clothes came off as vintage, while her misadventures in body art made her seem a fine vase, badly cracked and chipping, but a gritty accent to any room. "Cyril didn't come to my wedding," Cheyenne said. "Why should I go to his?" "Did you invite him?" "Hell no. He would have arrived like a lord and expected to walk me down the aisle. 'Here, let me give you away.' 'Oh, hey, Dad, I think you already did.' 'Yeah, you're right. He would have.' 'So why are we even going?' I have a day off work and it's cheaper than a movie. I'm tired of ramen and hot dogs and there'll be rich people food, so I'm taking Tupperware. Please don't make it obvious, said Cheyenne. We're already going to look so out of place. Oh, because you have jailhouse tattoos of hearts and clubs on your knuckles, or because I don't shave and look like a landscaper? Cheyenne spread the fingers of her left hand. Not just clubs and hearts. The one on the thumb is a diamond and the pinky is a spade, but you just can't tell anymore. Livy crossed to where she'd laid out her new washed painter's pants and pulled them on over her long johns. I'm going to the wedding because it's a show of support that cost me nothing. I've never thought of him as a dad. I don't care. At his worst, he's a big blank. He's a disappointment. He gets a clean slate. That's my wedding present, a pass. It's the only decent move. I shot my better angels, said Cheyenne. They're angels. You can't kill them, said Liddy. If they were real, you could. I'm going to read one other page just because so much of the book also gets into history. And on this day in particular, you know, there is, you know, this is all stolen land. And that sense of walking across that is in the novel and elements and sort of haunts the novel and comes up. And so I just want to read a section when they're well on the road. A few hours past Missoula, the land changed again, flattening and turning brown, scoured by wind. They crossed the Yellowstone and then followed it as it ran north by northeast, fed by the Yellowstone Lake. It had poured over the falls through the Black Canyon before they ever knew it. Past Billings and Yellowstone joined the Bighorn, which carried with it the Little Bighorn and the Tongue. As they drove, they saw signs for reenactments. Custer, stand with or against, your choice. And they heard talk in a rest area of a magnificent new state-of-the-art jail created from nothing but investor money and high-interest loans. Then they came to the Great Powder River, which is fed by the Little Powder, as well as oil from pipeline breaks, Red Cloud's War, and benzene as it joined the Yellowstone. The Yellowstone, which had already inherited so much, the Bighorn and the wind and the Tongue as it flowed towards the Missouri, which had no choice but to inherit the watershed as it drained to the Mississippi, that unstoppable force. And maybe there just is no way out of history. Maybe no matter how much you want to come from a different story, you can't. So I wanted to, just because it is Indigenous Peoples' Day.
Day. Absolutely. That's a wonderful, I love that line, Vanessa. I love that because I think we're just seeing right now the danger of denying our history and the genocidal origins.
And also the complexity of like, you know, how much history do we carry or not carry? How much of our own, like you're born upon a hill. That hill was not empty.
Yeah.
You were not part of the original contract, but you carry it. Like this kind of tension is also about, you know, I think part of the work of writing.
Absolutely. You know, we were talking a little bit about ghosts, and the sociologist I love who writes about haunting, she talks about just the pain of being born into a contest that you did not design, you know, and struggling for what matters and merits, you know, and inheriting this history and these structures, but really, you know, being born innocent in the sense that, you know, right, you were not the architect of the world that you come into, you know, and then of course also we're all implicated. She was just telling me about her frustration teaching Beloved, Toni Morrison's Beloved, and of course everybody wants to identify. Nobody wants to identify. She was like, none of my white students want to identify with school teacher. And so like finding a way to like teach this novel that's ample enough, you know, that you can stand in these different positions.
Right.
I really love hearing that section you read, because I think just speaking of total complexity, there's so much like gorgeous high lyricism in this book. And then there's also like, I don't know, just all kinds of scatological, like just like the funniest sex scene I've ever read that also manages
I'm glad you like that.
Confusingly, you know.
That was my goal.
Like I just think I was like, brava, because I think no one has gotten, there's like irritation and like, it's like kind of raunchy. And anyway, I really felt like there's just so much life in these pages. And I always get a little suspicious of stuff that just feels monotone, because that's just not what a day feels like. I mean, at the most desperate moments, there's still hilarity. And I was just thinking about, you could hear that in what you read, the way you manipulate distance, and there'll be this sort of like panoramic, omniscient sense of the history of our country. And then like a really intimate, close focus on, just like the the weirdness of, you see your mom, you've suffered this kind of unspeakable event, you're just going to make a sandwich and sit silently beside her, it felt, every part of it felt so authentic to me. And I guess this is a way of asking two things. One, maybe just because I'm curious, like, what if you have a favorite, if you have a line that just gets you every time, if you have a line or a scene where you're like, this was so fun to write, this makes me laugh, maybe impossible. And two, maybe more broadly, sort of the role of humor in a book like this one, because I do think it's hilarious, and that's something I haven't seen. As this book has been praised to the stars, and it totally deserves to be, and everyone should read it. But I feel like reviewers should also give you more credit for being like one of the funniest writers I've ever read. So,
well, thank you. I it's funny. I think that that's actually a characteristic of my work, and I think in part it's just that it goes to well, two things. And to me as a writer experiencing with it, I have a very evil, dark humor. Like, I really, I just sit there and go like, what's going to happen if you do that. Like I look at these characters and I think like, what's going to happen if you do that? Like and then it's just like the living it out part where like you don't shortcut it. I think a lot of humor comes from just how you watch it play out, like specifically, and then you have to put the groceries away. Like in this weird scene.
That's what I love. It's not like a movie montage, right? You're like, oh no, here comes a very awkward interstitial,
Exactly. So a lot of it comes in transitions, right? And, there is a scene that I did want in there and it stayed in there. Thank you to my editors, because it was one of those scenes that like, most sane editors would say, you don't need it. It moves the plot forward. It doesn't, we already know this about her. It doesn't reveal character, what I mean? But it meant something to me, which was the scene when there's a character named Livy who has undergone some very deep stresses, fishing and some tragedies, and she's got no money and she is desperately trying to get home. And she is, beg, borrowing, stealing across Alaska to try to get back. And there's only one person in the world who owes her money. And he owes her like, maybe a couple $100. And she goes to find him in Juneau, and he's spent the money and he's broke too. And he starts throwing the frozen food and is, you want my frozen food, and then she starts like packing up this frozen food. And then it's like, so it's comic, but it's also just like, I didn't want to give up that interaction, because to me, that interaction I've seen 1,000 times and it goes to what family means in this novel. He's not a bad person. He's a fuck up. But he is not a bad person. He has caused incredible harm to her by accident, but he is not a bad person. Neither of them have what they need. Neither of them have the resources. Neither of them have any options. And they're sort of like in this kitchen together, arguing over the frozen Stouffer's food. And there's this moment where she picks up a pot pie and she knows it's his favorite. And she's just like, fuck you, what do I have to think about what your pop, and at the same time, she ends up leaving it for him. And there is a generosity in that interaction that's real too, even though it's very, very comic. And I think that one of the things about the characters, the family in this novel, is that the precarity they're in is in part, there's, I've had people ask me like, well, there's a lot they don't tell each other. There's a lot of secrets that get kept. But most of them are kept out of fear that nobody has enough resources, emotional resilience, financial resilience, that if I tell you, if I tell you what actually happened to me, and then you have to carry the weight of that, or I tell you like what I need and you can't afford to give it to me, but you try, like whatever that is, that we will then tip each other over into a place where none of us get to to swim, you know? And so there's this way that I think these are characters that, yes, they're stubborn and prideful and all these things, but they are really earnestly trying not to have the precariousness of their own lives cost somebody else something. And I think that that's something that I want to try to find the words for. And humor sometimes is a really great way to live in the scenes, because there is the ridiculous and the tragic are easily set beside each other. They're just happening at different scales, right? Like one is right here in the interaction and the other one, whoop.
That's great.
Uh-oh.
I think we'll get it. Are we getting the hook?
Maris?
Not for me. No, keep going. Keep going.
Oh,
Okay,
Sorry.
Maris, your answer.
It's really
Okay.
Imposing M.
It's like that would be totally legitimate.
That must be Maris's special sign, like her baptismal.
Hearing some noise though. Okay, got it. Now I can't hear Maris, but I guess that's okay until Maris wants to be heard. Yeah, so, you know, with comedy, I think it's the way that, like, you know, you have a character who makes a big, bold decision to say, the hell with you, I'm going to do X. And then, like, really just stay with them living out the moment as they down the street. Like, that moment is going to get funnier as it goes, right? Like 2 blocks, 3 blocks, 5 blocks away, it's going to like get funnier and funnier, you know? And so I think some of the comedy is that. And I also think that, like, you know, a lot, like all my favorite comic writers, Kafka, Dostoevsky, people like this, you know, it's not until the second reads that you see it. Because in the first read, you're riveted to the story. But then when you read the second time, you realize how much joy and how much poking fun at oneself, and like with Crime and Punishment, how much Razumikin is sitting there just making fun of Raskolnikov over and over and over for the purpose of the joy of the writer, right? And for the person who reads it a second time. So a lot of times I think I had somebody say that to me once about Zazen. Like, I read it was so intense, and then I read it to my wife and I forgot how much, I didn't realize it was a comedy, you know, and it's just so, yeah.
Because it's pointing to the same sort of absurdity, right? Depending on kind of like that, your perspective or how identified you are with the character. I think that's so, I love that scene that you pointed to, because it's yet another case where it's so grim. I mean, what a terrible situation to be in, but it's also like, oh my God, this is desperation if you're taking a man's pot pie from his freezer.
Exactly.
And then, you know what I love in that scene? He says, thank you. I mean, they're screaming at each other. It's like, fuck you, you know, get out. And then he's like, well, you know, thank you. And there's so much kindness. I was thinking, I thought this was so hilarious. It's another moment of like a real bottom, where I think Shane's sitting at this diner and like she's thinking through her divorce. I don't want to give stuff away, but I mean, this is a bad moment.
It's divorced before their novel
starts. That's not, yeah. But I mean, there's also been a domino rally of various other misfortunes. And there's something hilarious about the pile-on, but it's true, you know? It's like, I mean, I know this happens to be, and just depending on your perspective, like when it's you, it feels like the book of Job, you know?
Yeah, right.
Pull out a little, you're like, human life, suffering is a guarantee, and the timing, you know, look at the season we're living in, you know?
And it's perfect what you just said, because I think I only write 2 books, Book of Jonah, Book of Job. It's like you're either like walking away from like what you should probably be turning around and facing to save everybody, right? Like, meaning like stop lying to yourself, or it's, you know, so I see a question.
She's sitting at this diner, and that, you know, and she's describing sort of like the wreckage of her life. And just as you said, right, she feels like I've run out the clock. Whatever expectations I had, whatever kind of story I thought I might, you know, be the protagonist of, I find myself totally lost. And it's like, you know, the lady behind the counter is like, well, everybody gets a test pancake. And it's like, there's something, I just believe, like the God I want to believe in would respond that way, you know, like it's just so funny. And there's a lot of warmth throughout that feels genuine, that doesn't feel sentimental, you know? And a lot of sort of like eye contact between people who are in bizarre but sympathetic states of being, you know. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. And I was thinking, reading this too, you know, I know you were sharing with me, I hope this is not too personal, that you had a reader who works a low wage job and is incredibly brilliant and is up against all kinds of, you know, structural difficulties, who read this and said she felt like she saw her experience mirrored back to her. And I was thinking about that too. I mean, I think people underestimate the poor. They underestimate the kind also, you
Yeah,
know.
they do. I mean, that situation you were talking about, it was, you know, when somebody thanks you for something that they should never have to thank you for, it's a particular kind of dangerous humility. I say dangerous because it's like, it feels like you're carrying, you know, the guilt of a society.
Yeah.
Like, you should never have to say to me, you have never seen yourself. Now, like, obviously that happens all over America. It happens with race. It happens with, you know, and with this woman in her way of talking about it, I can't give away part of the story, but she said, you know, I've tried so hard to make magic out of a shitty apartment in Beaverton with, like, you know, months behind on the rent, where like I have my altar, or I have my little setup, or I have like my curtains and candles or whatever I'm trying to create an ambiance with. And like, she said, I'm afraid that, you know, if I died or something, like somebody would flip on the lights and there'd be nothing but dust, you know, and it would all look so small. And, you know, I think that one way or another, that's what I mean when I'm talking about insight and all of us needing to bring what we particularly have to the table to get through this moment. Right. And I don't have that for everybody. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not the person to tell every story. But I think that I have real mixed feelings about, I mean, like, how do you take in something when it's like, you should never have to thank me for that. That should not be, I appreciate it. I'm glad I communicate, you know, I'm glad, I'm honored, but like, this should be your 80 millionth
Yeah.
book where you
There's
saw yourself, whoever you are, you know?
yeah, oh no, I'm thinking as you know, there's and again, not to give any away, but there's throughout this book, this note gets where it's sort of like we are invisible, and you know, we are just invisible in this culture, and this, like, we are not valued, you know, except maybe as parts in labor, as we were discussing, like we don't register in, you know, the collective consciousness, or you know, politically, like I think like I mean, these insomniacs in my book is a very different sort of like crew of marginalized people. But I was just thinking, you know, there's something about that night world
Yeah.
where you're really on the margins, and you're not.
Well, and think about who's in the night world. It's like, you know, there's shift pay for a reason, right? Like, nobody wants to be in the night world unless they're need the extra 50 cents. They're really antisocial, you know, or they know it's temporary and they have to do it to get into the day world, right? Like, there's not a lot of, I mean, those are, you know, exaggeration, but in terms of working in labor, you know, the night world is a very specific kind of thing. It's, you know,
Right,
it's every understaffed everything everywhere
right.
that, you know, um, yeah. So I didn't mean to cut you off on that.
Oh no, no. I just saw. I looked. There's some questions in
Okay.
our chat
We should we
box.
should we should remember that it's not just the
Yeah,
two
no,
of
it's
us
not.
in the room. Oh, sorry. I love talking to you. Sorry, Karen.
Yeah, we really locked on here. I think this is for you, Vanessa. This is Ishrat Syed. I remember you are the fort of young saplings and the unforgettable evocation of the Tlingit. This book seems an entire about turn.
They're Tlingit in this book a little bit. You know, there's one character who's half Tlingit up in Juneau. Fort of the Young Saplings, I don't agree with that. I think that this novel, in some ways, was, you know, when I put out my first novel, Zazen, and then I did my first long form work, one of the things I would hear a lot was that they didn't sound anything the same. That, like, you know, people would say I would never have put this writer with that writer and thought they were the same person. I think this novel in some ways was the coming together of those two streams in some respects, not completely, but I was trying to figure out how do you bring these two different ways that I like to write and think about things together. And I feel like part of what I was tracking on that was Fort of Young Saplings, the piece that you reference. a little bit in sort of the way that stories are told, but that's a little bit more in the narration in this book rather than necessarily the fullness of character. So I don't know, to me, it feels like it's not far from it. I mean, that was a very specific story about a very specific thing, but the ideas that I learned in that story about story ownership, about my own investigations in the piece, they are definitely in the novel, and Baranov is in the novel at different points, and sort of, so kind of the fiction vestiges of some of that experience very much ended up in The Great Offshore Grounds, I think. So yeah. And then I think there's one about music. Um, yeah, very briefly, yes, I am a musician and it affects me enormously. I hear rhythms and sounds are how I think and write. And I read back everything constantly, and I'm correcting for how I hear what I want in rhythms. So yes, quite a bit. I think this is for you, Karen.
I'm glad
love
this is,
your
I saw David Russell and I was like, this is going to be so weird. Is this my real father? It's going to be
I'll read you the question.
just like a theme night with Great Offshore Grounds. Like, oh God. Hi, David. No blood relation. I loved your talk with
okay.
Susan Minette on short stories, especially talking about the care with language that needs to be used. I know you had more freedom in Swamplandia while writing Sleep Donation, and always knowing it would be a novella was at heart, striking a balance between some expositions, but not too much. I didn't always know it would be a novella. I really thought it was going to be sort of just like a whimsical short story. Then for a little while, I thought it was going to be this Swiftian satire, which to me was very funny in a very dark way. I don't, not for everyone, I guess, but I was where they were going to steal babies' dreams and sleep. And then it just sort of became more earnestly anguished than I think satire would be, or it just, yeah, it's surprising that way. It also like ended up focusing a lot on bureaucracy, which
Yeah.
and and just sort of like, yeah, watching that pure impulse, right? Like a real desire to be part of this world circulatory system. And that, starting to feel, as I do, this protagonist feeling kind of pessimistic that she might be plugged into the wrong narrative, or that she might be now, a middle woman implicated in something that is quickly turning, from a sort of a gift economy into something a little bit darker. And, I mean, we're all part of this for-profit healthcare system ourselves. So I think it's, as Vanessa was discussing, if you go to the doctor and there's in like tiny 0.4 font, you're usually signing over any kind of blood or tissue, they can sell it to kind of like third-party vendors. And it's happening with our information, right? It's happening with like our private experience that's getting milled by Apple and Google and all of, our tech overlords into, our very private human experience, like the blood in our bodies. We do have this economic system that immediately commodifies,
So
brings new things into the market, but that's not his question. I'm sorry, David. I was just gonna say, I desperately need editors. And Vanessa was talking about the rigor of creativity and rigor, finding that balance. What I like about really committing to a premise, even a very strange premise, is it automatically is a kind of constraint.
Yeah.
And then I feel like I need constraints to imagine a world. Otherwise, it does seem like spelunking in the dark. Yeah, I have a really hard time. I've been struggling to write a second novel for like all the years of my life. I think in part because even with something like Sleep Donation, I think I was so happy to sort of explore this dimensional world, but have sort of a very tight focus on one woman. And that helped me a lot to have kind of like a human filtration system. And sort of like a pretty actually narrow set of questions. But yeah, novels, I don't know, Vanessa. I don't really know what they are. You leave the land for a long time.
Yeah. Sleep Donation, though, which is, there's so many great things about it. And I think also it is, we talked a little briefly about bureaucracy around normalizing around all those things. But I think the other counter to that is what becomes okay in an emergency. And what happens when you have a society that's in a constant emergency, right? Yeah. And so it's constantly okay. And like, that's also part of the conceit that's active in sleep donation as well. Like, and so I don't know if
It is scary. I mean, without turning too dark. I mean, this is something I think we're all thinking about now, right? I mean,
right.
contact tracing necessary, to get us to a steadier future. The terms and conditions that we all sort of like blindly agree to just to talk to each other on our iPhones, like, not to sound too dire, but I do sort of, it's a scary world, and it feels very, very difficult to opt out of some of these surveilling, to protect your data, to protect, I think like this protagonist feels a real tension between her desire really to do real good, to share something of herself, and sort of a warranted fear that this is not a world that's going to respect nature's limits. It's not going to respect human limits, and it's not going to drain everybody in an equitable way. I mean,
Right.
you see that in the great offshore grounds too. It's the, the that kind of exploitation that is so pervasive. We're inured to it.
Right.
Strange to break into this conversation right now, but it is just about that time. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
You can watch this on YouTube later to add.
Thanks, Maris.
Please buy Vanessa and Karen's books. That would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you guys for coming, all of you,
Thank you
so
guys so
much.
much for coming on a weeknight.
Yeah.
Nice.
Thanks,
to
Karen.
Oh, thanks, Vanessa.
Bye, Maris.
We love you more.
Bye.
Thanks, friends. Bye.